Hi, everyone, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, excuse me. I'm so excited that I couldn't even say the last letter of my own name. That's how much material I have to cover tonight, you guys. In this, the 12th session of our journey through American Gods, both Neil Gaiman's seminal novel and the increasingly impressive, though also increasingly divisive, Starz TV adaptation. More on that tomorrow when we release the 13th episode of Storms on the Way, our discussion of episode 5 of the show, Lemon Scented You. Everything got a little delayed because of Memorial Day weekend here in the United States, but hopefully we'll be able to catch up very soon. Stay tuned to the end of tonight's broadcast for some important scheduling information. Tonight, though, we look at Chapter 9, and I know that I said Chapter 9 and 10, but the more I read Chapter 9, the more I studied Chapter 9, the more I discovered to say about Chapter 9, and I'm going to skip over large chunks of it. Even then, I'm going to have a lot of material to cover. It's a genuinely fascinating study of Shadow's character, the way that Shadow interacts with the world, and we get a couple of very interesting and hitherto unique perspectives on America. So we'll have a lot to discuss, but we're going to begin by discussing some names. So stay tuned for that. Hello to everyone here in the YouTube chat. As Jean says here in the YouTube chat, Chapter 9 is simple but has a lot of depth. And Sarah Thomas says, Chapter 9 has the most realistic American feeling to me. I love it. Sarah, that is a fascinating observation because it does, and yet, it's almost a preternatural feeling of America. It's almost a supernatural feeling of America in, I guess, if I can break the word supernatural into its constituent parts there and apply full meaning to both of them. It is a heightened, more real than real vision of America, and that is both deliberate in terms of foreshadowing for later in the story, but also deliberate at this point, because at this point in the novel, we've just had Shadow's what should we say, his brief vacation, his brief interregnum, a cessation of hostilities here in the movement of the primary plot. He just came away from Cairo, where he was passing his time with Ibis and Jakal and had something of a restorative experience there, not least of all, of course, because of his dream sex with Bast, which has left him physically restored, but for the scratches that he now bears, though we can speculate that those are healing at least a little more rapidly than the terrible bruises and harm done to him in the course of the book so far. So he had something of a break. He had something of a vacation. And now we're moving into a part of the book that focuses on Shadow's suspension from the primary plot. He's going to be pulled back in, but then reset back to Lakeside. So we're going to spend a lot of time, I think, tonight talking about Lakeside. We have a little material to get through before we get there. As Sarah Thomas says, oh, thank goodness, Chapter 9 is fantastic. Forget all that only America considers itself nonsense. Give me a good diner and a bus ride, Sarah. We are, as ever, of one mind, of course. Good. So let's begin by a quick recap here. You can contribute to the conversation here in the YouTube chat. I see everything that unfolds. You can also contribute via Twitter using the hashtag Storms on the Way, and that is true, not the hashtag Storms on the Way, the hashtag Storms OTW, forgive me. That's true during the live session, of course, but also through the course of the rest of the week. I can pick up the threads that you lay forth there, and there have been, of course, some fascinating conversations unfolding on Twitter. You can also, if you are a supporter of Point North Media over on patreon.com/PointNorthMedia, contribute using the Discord channel. The Discord channel seems to be behaving itself a little more reliably these days. So there are some wonderful conversations happening over there, including a full-throated and passionate, spoiler-filled discussion of all of American Gods. So if you have theories, if you want to talk about them, or better yet, if you have read the whole book and want to talk about either how the novel is treating its own internal mysteries as it moves forward, or how the TV show is adapting those questions, then that is the place for you. And a quick note before we begin, because we're approaching the end of the month, and this is when the Patreon fees all cycle, and I actually get your support, which is lovely. This has been a huge month for Point North Media. You guys have been generous in your support, as you always are, and we are approaching rapidly a point of ongoing sustainability, which is a huge relief, quite frankly. It's very, very lovely to have this kind of support thrown behind the work that we've been doing at Point North Media. So thank you to everyone who is a Patreon supporter. And if you aren't yet, I urge you to do so, not least of all, because if you support at the $20 a month level, then you get to choose the topic for a Point North one-shot. Tomorrow, as I record this, probably today as this podcast is released, you will be able to hear me spend an hour talking about the movie High Noon, about which I have a lot to say. It's going to be a really, really interesting discussion, and High Noon was selected by a Patreon supporter, by the lovely Leslie McAdoo-Gordon over on patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. So if you would like me to discuss any text of your choosing, patreon.com/pointnorthmedia, and thank you all so much for your support. Let's get into our discussion then, and as I said, we're going to begin with a discussion of names. I kind of foreshadowed this last week, and then kind of gave it the swerve because I didn't really want to get into that discussion prior to our introduction of Shadow's new alter ego in chapter 9. But it is worth considering at this point that we are moving into part 2 of the book. The first part, as you may or may not recall, was entitled Shadows. The second part is entitled My Ain Sal, and we'll talk about the meaning of that word in just a minute, because I want to reflect first on part 1. I want to talk about shadows, plural. Who were the shadows who we were introduced to in the first part of the book? Because we had a fairly effective, fairly thorough, certainly dispiriting in parts, heartbreaking in parts, inspiring deconstruction of Shadow Moon's character, of his humanity. We met him at a point where he had already been, in effect, somewhat deconstructed and then reconstructed. He had gone to prison. He had left the life that he knew behind. He had gone into prison and increased his mass, increased his size, but also improved his mind. He had read, he had practiced his coin tricks. He had come to a new peace, but he had come to a new peace as a new man, re-entering the world and looking to reintegrate these two versions of himself, or to, I guess, integrate for the first time these two versions of himself. He runs into the hard truth of grief. He discovers that Laura has died. He discovers, of course, the circumstances of Laura's death, and is challenged by that, is threatened by that, is almost in part broken by that. Certainly his sense of himself, his personality, his identity, and the way in which those things are defined, the landmarks that he uses to navigate his own personality have been altered. Some have been outright removed, and one important one was removed and then partially restored, which is no easier, I think, than having it remain there in the first place. Then he falls in with Wednesday. He is actively recruited for Wednesday's war, and in so doing finds himself pulled from the mundane world into the magical. He has experienced remarkable things. He has experienced the carousel. He has experienced snow. He has experienced, and we'll talk a little about Wednesday's cons in the course of this chapter, the bank robbery. He has seen things and heard things and done things which would have seemed impossible. So how do we reconcile these different versions of Shadow? Are we reconciling, in fact, different versions of Shadow? Or is there a sense in which each of these perspectives on Shadow is as incomplete as the others? Do we have a sense that Shadow's true self was his pre-prison self, his prison self, his post-prison self, his magic God War self? Where is the true Shadow to be found? Well, I don't think that the book actually gives us an answer on that. Quite the opposite. I think the book denies us an answer on that. And in the opening movement of part 2 of the book, we're going to see a couple of different ways in which Shadow becomes. A couple of different ways in which Shadow is reintroduced to the world. We're going to see a really interesting metaphorical dream birthing process in the course of this chapter. That, of course, carries powerful connotation when it comes to identity, when it comes to personality, when it comes to being and presence and, I guess, shadowness. But we're also going to see his adoption of a new pseudonym, Mike Ainsel. And what is most interesting about that particular name, of course, and neither of these names is accidental. We'll talk about Odin's name. We'll talk about Wednesday's name in just a moment. But it's curious to think about Michael Ainsel, because, of course, I should say, for those of you who perhaps don't know, I am Scottish. So the first time that I read this, I was aware of the pun. I was aware of the nominative double entendre that is happening here, because my ain sel, that is my own self in Scots English. So when we're talking about my Ainsel, as the part of the second part of the novel is entitled, or if we're talking about Mike Ainsel, obviously the contraction there is evident to all. What we're talking about is this sense of Shadow's own self. The degree to which he is adopting this persona, I think, speaks very powerfully to that. That is going to continue through the next few chapters, but that movement certainly begins in the here and now of the story. I said that I would talk a little about Gene says here in the YouTube chat, miniature unrelated note, as much as I like how many people watch the live sessions for There and Back Again, that is my Tolkien seminar series, which runs on Thursdays, Gene continues, the chat gets super overwhelming. I love our motley 20-something crews for these. It's true. It's true. The There and Back Again chat is riotous. It is a veritable, Elrond's council of conversation. But here, this is a little more intimate. It's a little more casual. It's like we're all hanging out at an all-American diner just talking about the things that we love, or perhaps a small-town bookstore. He said, choosing something random, which a few people have already mentioned in the YouTube chat, and which speaks, I'm sure, to us all. Yes. Yes. So that's it. That's my ain cell is related directly to Shadow's own self. But that's not all, because Wednesday is also going to use a pseudonym as we move forward, but it's a pseudonym that is introduced within the span of this chapter, and that is Emerson Borson. He says it is an unlikely name, and it certainly is. In order to understand this name, we have to understand two vital things. The first is that the father of Odin is Bor, B-O-R, in most cases, in most English transliterations of the runic alphabet, B-O-R-R, Bor, father of Odin. So Odin, technically speaking, would be Odin Borson. That is how familial names worked in Norse cultures. But that's not all, because the first name contains a little Easter egg too. And here we flash back to the end of the second chapter of the book and the passage wherein the Northmen first come to America. The All-Father made the world, he shouted. He built it with his hands from the shattered bones and the flesh of Ymir, his grandfather. He placed Ymir's brains in the sky as clouds, and his salt blood became the seas we crossed. If he made the world, do you not realize that he created this land as well? And if we die here as men, shall we not be received into his hall? The grandfather of Odin, in this particular version of the myth, is Ymir. And that is not simple. There are different versions of the Norse myths, obviously. Ymir can also be thought of as a kind of proto-god, a kind of creator god in Norse myths. So he is, in some versions, literally Odin's grandfather. That is, he is the father of Bor. And in other versions of the story, he is kind of grandfather to us all. In some versions, he's actually Odin's father, but still retains the grandfather honorific because of his status, because of his different relationship. All of that is to say that Ymir's son Borson, or if you like, Emerson Borson, is a perfect name for Wednesday, because it is actually referring to his lineage here. He is son of Bor, son of Ymir, or if you like, Ymir's son, Bor's son, Odin. This is where he is. Okay, so that's just a little fun with names. Those are just a couple of Easter eggs tucked away there. Yes, good, good. Oh, we have Luke is here. Luke is joining us for the first time. Excellent. Good to have you, Luke. Glad to have you here. Lauren says, today while listening to chapter 10, I had a thought about how shadows change as the light changes. And maybe that has to do with Shadow and his name, but I did not form a total thought. Lauren, that is fascinating. And it's fascinating in part because of the absence of another very, very common motif. Gaiman does not rely, primarily speaking, on, I was going to say light and dark motifs, but he relies on light and dark motifs all the time. He relies on black and white motifs all the time, light and dark in that sense. But he doesn't often rely on the movement of light and the dark cast by the shadows from that light, of course. Shadow does exist between light and dark. That's fairly evident from his name, pretty much right from page 1. But Gaiman doesn't generally go to that rather exhausted and depleted well of metaphor. This reminds me of the checkers game with Chernobog. I said at the time that any other writer, basically any other writer, would have used chess. Chess has a strong Slavic tradition. Chess certainly has a strong American tradition. It would have been appropriate, and it would have allowed the author in this case to develop a much more complex underlying metaphor, a much more complex fundamental metaphor for that sequence. But instead, Gaiman went to checkers because checkers is more American. It is more transparent in a sense. So I like very much that Gaiman tends to steer away from common sets of motifs and instead goes a little darker, goes a little further, goes a little deeper, I should say. I probably shouldn't say darker in this sense, though thematically, at least, that is true too. But we can certainly think of Shadow as a reactive character. Shadows do not themselves have presence. Shadows do not themselves have mass. And we might wonder to what degree Shadow is in any way self-definitive. In what sense he is anyway, deterministic of his own self, of his own cell, if you like. And in what sense Shadow is reactive, particularly because reactivity, as we've discussed previously, is curious in the pages of American Gods. We see the gods themselves being reactive. The gods themselves follow after belief. Human beings have agency. Gods don't, or at least not entirely. They have an incomplete kind of agency because the god can never be separated from the story of the god, can never be separated from the myth of the god, can never be separated from belief. Human beings can. And I will say, for those of you who aren't watching the Starz TV adaptation, that I think the show is doing a really interesting job of exploring that idea specifically through the character of Laura. There are some very free adaptations with Laura's character, and in fact, many, many scenes which are just created out of whole cloth for Laura's character. But we're getting a different perspective on belief as it applies to beings other than gods. I'll put it no more specifically than that. Good, good. Andrea says that once I finally figured out who Wednesday was and got what was going on in the book, I so enjoyed figuring out who each god was and then reading about them. Yes, yes. And Jean says Checkers has old roots too, though. No, it absolutely does. As I said when I was discussing the scene with Chernobog, it's not that Checkers is inappropriate for that scene, for that sequence, for that cultural reference. Quite the contrary, it's extremely appropriate. But it is also a more American game. This idea of egalitarianism that doesn't really live up to any kind of scrutiny whatsoever is perhaps quintessentially American in that regard. Again, we've been talking about that a little bit. I have been talking about that a little bit with the wonderful Elizabeth and Daphne over on the TV episodes of Storms on the Way. Yes, good. Oh, yes, we're mentioning one of my favorites here. I don't see the original origin here, but Sarah Thomas says it's almost a Garrison Keillor tip of the hat from Gaiman. I assume we're talking about Lakeside, which is one of the things that I was mentioning earlier when I talked about Lakeside's presence as a more American than America. This kind of heightened place. It feels, yes, a little bit like Wobegon. It feels a little bit like Stars Hollow. It feels like these perfect conceptualized American small towns that don't actually exist. And that's fascinating because Gaiman has been so painstaking up to this point of showing us both sides of America. The vision, yes, but also the reality. And Lakeside does not feel to the same degree undercut by reality. Now that is incredibly purposeful, as I said, in terms of the plot. There will be reveals later in the book that will explain a great deal of what is happening in Lakeside and why it is special. But it also works as a utopian idyll. I mean, it also works as the perfect encapsulation of small-town America, and that is not accidental, particularly when it's juxtaposed so forcefully with Cairo, which we just came from. Cairo already has a sense of this small-town idyll. You know, it already feels true to American gods. On the one hand, it feels as though it's a consistent part of this world, but it also feels pretty perfect. Lakeside feels different, and we'll begin to discuss that in this chapter and track that through the next few chapters, certainly. Oh, I'm sorry. Sarah says I was talking about Wednesday's alternative name, Emerson Borson. No, of course. Yes, it does sound Keillor-esque. You're absolutely right. Yes, no, it's a perfect kind of, it's a perfect upper Midwest kind of name. It has all of the kind of ungainly artistry that you would expect. Yes, and if any of you haven't heard, of Garrison Keillor, I mean, presumably you've heard of Garrison Keillor, but if you haven't actually read Garrison Keillor's work, do, particularly as an adjunct to American Gods. Go read Lake Wobegon Days, and you will find a very familiar perspective on small-town America from the pages of American Gods. Good. Excellent. Let me see here. So if we all believed in Stars Hollow hard enough, says Aaron, could we make it real? Well, let's find out. That's all I can say. Though I don't feel as though Stars Hollow is suffering from a lack of belief. Let me tell you. I have spent a little time in the Hudson River Valley, which isn't quite Western Connecticut, but is awfully close. And there are towns out there that are not Stars Hollow. I'll put it that way. Yes, good. And all the children are above average, says Sarah Thomas. Yes, good. As Sarah says, yes, so many people do not like Keeler, but I adore him. Keeler gets a bad rap, honestly, and I completely understand why A Prairie Home Companion is not for everyone, even his Writer's Almanac podcast and radio show, not for everyone. It's a very particular style, but go read his original fiction, and you will find a writer of uncommon sensitivity, uncommon thoughtfulness, and a real playfulness. It's not something that you would generally associate with Garrison Keeler, but there is a sly wit underpinning his writing that I think makes the whole thing work. I adore Like Wobegondes and will eventually talk about it for a seminar. Yes, good. Chesley says here, Mike is who Shadow wants to be, so the town Mike occupies is the perfect town to match Shadow's ideal man. Well, this is something that I wanted to, I think you're right, Chesley. Absolutely. First of all, I should concede the point. Yes. Secondly, I want to track the ways in which Lakeside speaks to Shadow's truth, Shadow's sense of himself, Shadow's sense of America, Shadow's sense of small towns, because lest we forget, he chose to leave Eagle Point because it had never been his home. He had moved around as a child. He had never put down the roots that Laura had. Eagle Point was her town. Is Lakeside Shadow's town? If so, what do we make of that? If so, what does that tell us about Shadow? And if so, what do we make of Shadow's integration into this town under an assumed name? To what degree is Mike Ainsel real and Shadow fictional? And to what degree is the opposite true? Does that make sense? Okay, we'll continue to track it. Good. All right. Let's get into it then, because here we are, 20 minutes in, and I haven't hit my first slide. Hey, drink. Let's get to our first question, because we open this part of the novel, we open this chapter with Shadow finally asking some questions. As they drove out of Illinois late that evening, Shadow asked Wednesday his first question. He saw the Welcome to Wisconsin sign and said, "So who were the bunch that grabbed me in the parking lot? Mr. Wood and Mr. Stone, who were they?" The lights of the car illuminated the winter landscape. Wednesday had announced that they were not to take freeways because he didn't know whose side the freeways were on, so Shadow was sticking to back roads. He didn't mind. He wasn't even sure that Wednesday was crazy. Wednesday grunted. "Just spooks, members of the opposition, black hats." "I think," said Shadow, "that they think they're the white hats." "Of course they do. There's never been a true war that wasn't fought between two sets of people who were certain they were in the right. The really dangerous people believe that they're doing whatever they're doing solely and only because it is without question the right thing to do. And that is what makes them dangerous." "And you?" asked Shadow. "Why are you doing what you're doing?" "Because I want to," said Wednesday. And then he grinned. "So that's all right." Wednesday's wise-ass reply aside, I think we see here a legitimate tension. We see here a real conflict between people who fight for principle or belief, for these people who believe that they are doing whatever they are doing solely and only because it is without question the right thing to do, quote unquote, TM at the end of that sentence, and those people who do what they want. Those people who do, in a sense, what they are. And that seems to me to be a strong part of the conflict between the new gods and the old. New gods are defined by role. They're defined, in a sense, by purpose. They do what they do because they believe it is right. Technical Boy is an evangelist. Media is an evangelist. Other new gods that we may meet later may also be evangelistic in nature. Odin isn't, though it's odd, of course, to think about gods who aren't evangelistic in nature. I guess to a certain degree, all gods are, but Wednesday isn't. Wednesday is. He doesn't do what he believes is right. He does what he knows to be true of himself. And that is a key distinction. We might think of this distinction as some people do and some people are. And the people who do are trouble, because they're always pursuing something. There's always an internal tension there between their belief and their nature, if you like. Knowing one's own nature, and this is, of course, key as we make this pivot out of shadows and into My Ainsel, knowing who you are, knowing what you are, is the key to power. That is the key to presence, at least as Wednesday is arguing here. Yeah. Aaron is, yes, Angela is arguing for a Gilmore Girls American Gods crossover, and Aaron came up with the perfect name, Gilmore Gods. Well, now I think there needs to be a Tumblr with captions of either American Gods with Gilmore Girls quotes or vice versa, or hey, both of those things. I think Gilmore Gods, you know, the logo writes itself. Yes. Aaron continues, now I can't stop thinking about how Lorelai could do a lot worse than Shadow. I kind of ship it, though there's not, in many ways, a huge discontinuity between Lorelai Gilmore and Laura Moon. And it's not just the fact that their names are somewhat similar. So here we get the introduction to the kind of factual introduction of the spooks, members of the opposition, black hats, as Wednesday says. And we're going to come full circle here with our little coda at the end of chapter 9. Meanwhile, a conversation which reintroduces us to Sam and contains, honestly, some of my favorite dialogue in the entire book. We'll get to that right at the end of tonight's session, but I could have just read that entire 2-page thing because it is just gorgeous. Yes, Andrea's calling out here, freeways as gods. Well, maybe. I was thinking about this too. And if American Gods as a novel wasn't purporting to talk so directly about the Midwest, but was instead talking about the West Coast, then I could almost see the argument. Because I'm a fan of LA noir. I'm a fan of West Coast noir. And in pretty much every noir story set in Los Angeles, we get the story of the building of the freeways, that the coming of the freeways will change this city. The coming of the freeways will revitalize, will re-energize, will redefine the city. And I can absolutely see the belief being poured into the freeways in Los Angeles being sufficient to kindle a god. But in this sense, I don't think that's what we're saying, because the routes across the Midwest were already semi-formalized. They were already in place before the coming of the freeway infrastructure. So instead, I think it is in fact that infrastructure which we're suspicious of. It is this kind of, federal infrastructure. There is a sense in which we're pushing toward a suspicion of the government, not, I think, in a social sense or even a political sense, but in the sense that power removed from the people is something of which we ought to be suspicious. And of course that makes sense for Wednesday, because Wednesday very much puts value in the power of individuals and individual belief. So that's kind of where I come down from. I come down on this question. It's not necessarily that the freeways are, sentient, that there isn't a freeway god. I don't quite know what form that, just presumably some horrible traffic jam. Though perhaps, now that I think of it, you're thinking about, any standard freeway intersection at rush hour. You're thinking about hundreds of cars stuck in a jam. You're thinking about the prayer and the energy and the focus and the will that is exerted on just making this traffic move. Oh, perhaps freeways are alive. Perhaps freeways are sentient. Perhaps freeways are gods, and perhaps we end up praying to them more often than we might think. It's entirely possible. Yeah. Garrett says, interstate highways are dumb. Classic highways like Route 66 are extremely smart. Route 66 actually runs right through Oklahoma City right here. And I am thinking about, I'm pretty much always thinking about taking a road trip anyway. And I'm thinking about taking a road trip either way on Route 66. I hear that the best part of Route 66 is west of Oklahoma City all the way out to California. That certainly appeals to me. That appeals to my, broad skies, endless horizon road trip kind of vision. But Route 66 up through St. Louis, up to Chicago, that sounds pretty good too, I have to tell you. And there is, of course, a romance there. There is, and Route 66 and very few other roads, the PCH maybe. Very few roads are as iconic as Route 66. But I do think that speaks to this sense of America, of Americana. And certainly, we've been talking about roadside attractions too. We've been talking about the mobility and the fluidity of American social cultures. We've been talking about the ways in which American individuals are free to move. They are themselves individually mobile, and thus culture is in aggregate mobile. And I think that these arteries of traffic and transit are probably important in that sense. Yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. Yes. Good. All right. Narnia says, well, now this makes, excuse me, it's the YouTube chat scrolled. Narnia says, well, now this makes me make me think I have created a laundry god. Every time a sock goes missing, I call it a sacrifice to the laundry god. Well, I hate to tell you this. We all do that. And the laundry god is growing in power deep beneath the ocean in R'lyeh, where it lies. Yeah. Good. Excellent. All right. Aaron says, if I believe in anything, it's L-space. L-space, of course, a theory of Terry Pratchett's, a creation of Terry Pratchett's that Neil Gaiman would certainly enjoy, I'm sure. Yes. Good. All right. Let's keep going. Now that we've had our first question, we get to Wednesday's accounts of his cons. And we're going to begin here with the fiddle game. Some things may change, said Wednesday abruptly. People, however, people stay the same. Some grifts last forever. Others are swallowed soon enough by time and by the world. My favorite grift of all is no longer practical. Still, a surprising number of grifts are timeless. The Spanish prisoner, the pigeon drop, the phony rig. That's the pigeon drop, but with a gold ring instead of a wallet. The fiddle game. I've never heard of the fiddle game, said Shadow. I think I've heard of the others. My old cellmate said he'd actually done the Spanish prisoner. He was a grifter. Oh, said Wednesday, and his left eye sparkled. The fiddle game was a fine and wonderful con. In its purest form, it's a two-man grift. It trades on cupidity and greed, as all great grifts do. You can always cheat an honest man, but it takes more work. So, we're in a hotel, or an inn, or a fine restaurant, and dining there we find a man, shabby, but shabby genteel, not down at heel, but certainly down on his luck. We shall call him Abraham. And when the time comes to settle his bill, not a huge bill, you understand, $50, $75, an embarrassment. Where is his wallet? Good Lord, he must have left it at a friend's not far away. He shall go and obtain his wallet forthwith. But here, mine host, says Abraham, take this old fiddle of mine for security. It's old, as you can see, but it's how I make my living. Wednesday's smile when he saw the waitress approaching was huge and predatory. Oh, the hot chocolate, brought to me by my Christmas angel. Tell me, my dear, can I have some more of your delicious bread when you get a moment? The waitress, what was she, Shadow wondered, 16, 17, looked at the floor and her cheeks flushed crimson. She put down the chocolate with shaking hands and retreated to the edge of the room by the slowly rotating display of pies, where she stopped and stared at Wednesday. Then she slipped into the kitchen to fetch Wednesday his bread. I am going to resist the urge to read the entire grift. I'm going to resist the urge to read the bishop game at all, because while this prose is beautiful, while it is a storyteller at the height of his craft, writing a storyteller at the height of his craft, we could spend all evening just talking about the movement of the grift itself. And if you're into that, as I am super into that, cannot recommend enough the TV show Leverage, which does a con like this every single week of its run. I think Leverage lasted 5 seasons. It's pretty great if you're into the workings of con man. Yes. We're discussing Leverage right here in the YouTube chat, in fact. Excellent. Good. Though Becca Eller calls out, all my missing socks go directly to freeing house elves. You are a good person, Becca. You're a good person. So let's consider here the movement of the grift, if you like. This is not a part of Odin's personality. This is not a part of Odin's essential nature. He was wise and playful, as so many classical gods were. He was not above tricks and trickery, but this was not how he was primarily defined. There is, of course, a character in Norse mythology who was primarily defined as a trickster. We'll maybe talk about him someday. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to talk about Loki someday within the frame of this book. But what's interesting here is the movement of Wednesday away from his traditional role and into this kind of itinerant conman life. He talked before about making ends meet however you can after you have kind of stepped down, been taken down from your original pedestal. Times are tough for an old god in the new world, and he makes his living trading off of people's cupidity and greed. You can con an honest man, but it's harder. It takes more time. So here he lays out this con, which is in its incidental movement beautiful, and is in its incidental movement. There we go. Mastered that sentence. Now on to the next one. Actually, rather illustrative of a point that we've discussed before. We've observed, Shadow himself has observed, that he has the skill necessary to be a magician, the skill necessary to be a pickpocket, to be a thief. He is extremely deft with his hands, and particularly with his coin tricks, but he lacks the narrative artistry to sell the trick. He can do the trick, but he can't tell the story. Here, Wednesday effortlessly does the trick by telling the story. Here, he gives us such an insight. Do you not, as you read, firstly the fiddle game and then the bishop game too, do you not want these con men to succeed? Do you not want them to push back against the bounds of society? Do you not want these thieves and liars and charlatans to be maybe just a little successful? Don't we think collectively that they've kind of earned it through their ingenious intellect, through their performative skill, through their mastery of stories and storytelling? This is why I think con men are as attractive in fiction as they are, because they allow us to kind of double down on these narrative conceits. Here we have a man telling a story about a man telling a story. And that is always powerful. That is always effective when you frame fiction within fiction, particularly when you are given this privileged vantage point, when you're allowed to understand that this is a grift. He makes no bones about it. He's not just telling a story, he's telling us about a con. But then we enter so fully into his subcreation, into his secondary world, that we're engaged by it. We care about Abraham. We care. The fictional character Abraham, portrayed by the fictional character within the story that Wednesday, himself a fictional character, is relating to us. The layers of narrative here are incredibly rich and rewarding, and still we are sucked into it. There is here no alienation device. There is here no forced reminder that we are experiencing a story. Not until the end, not until we are pulled back out of the story into Shadow's POV, which is, of course, deliberate and functional too. Here we're allowed to fully enter into, well, the making of myth. Here, Wednesday is not even necessarily telling a story about a specific grift. He's not telling this one time in New York, here's how we did the fiddle game. No, he's telling the archetypal version of the fiddle game. He's telling the myth of the grift. Myths, as we've seen so many times now from so many different perspectives, are enormously powerful. And no one is a better storyteller than Wednesday. Well, maybe no one, because we're going to meet later in this chapter a man who is perhaps an equally good storyteller. We'll talk about him when we get there. Luke says, we love gods because of their stories. It's their essential power. If Odin doesn't go to the tree and hang, he's not great. Yes, I completely agree. But they are, what separates the con man from the god is exactly that distinction that I was talking about earlier, the distinction between gods and human beings. Human beings have agency. Gods don't. The degree to which Odin has been able over the years to adapt his own persona and embrace this life is actually a fascinating question. There's a really interesting kind of tangled, knotted ball of speculation that we can slowly unpick there, had we but world enough and time. Why is Odin capable of living this life when, for example, Chernobog is not? Chernobog has been diminished America, but has not been able to adapt in quite the way that Wednesday has. Is this a function of a certain fluidity to Wednesday's foundational myth, to Odin's foundational myth? Well, perhaps. Is this functionally a consequence of Odin's, the kind of company that Odin keeps? I'll say no more than that for now. Possibly. But it may also just be proof of his greatness, of his strength. Are the greatest old gods more possessed of agency than the weaker old gods? Is Wednesday more capable of taking direct action on his own than Chernobog? Well, if we study the movement of the plot, the answer unequivocally has to be yes. Now, is this proof of Wednesday's greatness, or is this proof of Wednesday's fluidity? Is there enough gap, enough space, enough warp in his foundational myth, in his foundational mythology, I suppose, to allow for that? Well, possibly. But we're going to keep our eyes on this idea of agency as we move forward, because, well, Lakeside will give us a couple of interesting perspectives in that regard, ultimately. Yeah. Let me see here, catching up with the YouTube chat. Are we talking? Nancy is a great storyteller, says Lauren. Yes, Nancy also a great storyteller. This is something that the gods have in common. I mean, the Zarias are great storytellers. Chernobog, in his way, is a great storyteller. His stories are ugly and brutal and blunt, but then of course they are, because he's the Slavic black god. I mean, he's never going to seduce in the way that Wednesday will seduce. And when I say seduce, of course, I don't necessarily mean the waitress, because I think we're probably all, as Angela says here in the YouTube chat, here you are, Angela, as ever, anticipating my next thought. Wednesday hitting on and taking advantage of the waitress is beyond gross, but the reason for it is interesting. He is growing cold. Yes, he is. We'll get to that in just a moment. So we also get the discussion of the bishop game, which, as I said, I had to, pull 4 slides and then delete them all, because that's the rest of our evening. Otherwise, the bishop game is fascinating, though, not least of all because we just had reference to bishops. We just had a conspicuous and odd and out-of-place reference to bishops in the last chapter. During Shadow's dream sex with Bast, we get this brief quote. I didn't put this on a slide, so I just have it here in my notes. A fragment of nonsense bubbled up from somewhere in his mind. In medieval days, it was said that a woman on top during coitus would conceive a bishop. That was what they called it, trying for a bishop. It seems odd to me that these two bishops are so closely aligned in the text and yet seemingly completely without interaction. There doesn't seem to be any kind of reference between the two that I can unpick. If you were smarter than I am, as, let's face it, all of you are, and you can see some connection between trying for a bishop with Bast and the bishop game as Wednesday lays it out, then please shout out in the YouTube chat or email me, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. Excellent. Oh, yes, Luke is calling out. Someone actually emailed me about this, and I don't think that I remember who it was to quote this. But yes, Luke says, cool thing I found out this week, Chernobog is the demon in Fantasia. He certainly is, yes. If you go to Chernobog's IMDb page, it definitely has that listed as a credit, yes. Good. All right, excellent. Okay, so let's keep going. Because we have one more, we have a moment of realization from Shadow before we're done with scams for this week's reading. Hey, Wednesday, both of the scams you were telling me about, the violin scam and the bishop one, the bishop and the cop, he hesitated, trying to form his thought to bring it into focus. What of them? Then he added, they're both two-man scams, one guy on each side. Did you used to have a partner? Shadow's breath came in clouds. He promised himself that when he got to Lakeside, he would spend some of his Christmas bonus on the warmest, thickest winter coat that money could buy. Yes, said Wednesday. Yes. I had a partner, a junior partner. But alas, those days are gone. There's the gas station, and there, unless my eye deceives me, is the bus. It was already signaling its turn into the parking lot. Your address is on the key, said Wednesday. If anyone asks, I am your uncle, and I shall be rejoicing in the unlikely name of Emerson Borson. Settle in Lakeside, nephew Ansel. I'll come for you within the week. We shall be traveling together, visiting the people I have to visit. In the meantime, keep your head down and stay out of trouble. Firstly, we can tie that last line all the way back to the very beginning of the book. What were Shadow's three desires coming out of prison? He wanted to have a bath, he wanted to have sex with his wife, and then he wanted to keep his head down and stay out of trouble forever. Here, Wednesday, having plucked him unceremoniously from that life, having taken him halfway across the world and shown him wonders, is now returning him to a status quo. And this is one of the things that I think encourages us to look at Lakeside as it is presented to us and Eagle Point as it is not presented to us. As I discussed when we moved through those sections earlier in the book, Eagle Point is almost a gaping hole at the heart of the narrative of American Gods. We just don't get anything. But we don't get anything, I think, in part because it isn't Shadow's, because he doesn't belong there. He's not even seeing it. All he sees in Eagle Point, particularly upon his return, is Laura. This is different. Before we move on, though, I want to talk a little about this interaction because this is an odd one. Hey, Wednesday, both of the scams you were telling me about, the violin scam and the bishop one, the bishop and the cop, he hesitated trying to form his thought to bring it into focus. What is so difficult about this thought for Shadow? Why is he struggling so much to pin down what feels like a fairly elementary thought? And it may well be an elementary thought that occurred to you, dear reader, as you were moving through Wednesday's accounts of the cons. It certainly occurred to me as I was reading the second con. I'm curious about why this is so difficult for Shadow. Except that Shadow is intuiting. He is logically connecting something that has not been told him outright. Here, he isn't thinking about something that he has learned directly of Wednesday. Here he is inferring from Wednesday's account something that is nonetheless true. Is there within Wednesday's guise, within his shroud of identity, of pseudonymity, I guess, something that pushes back against being known? Is it difficult for people, for anyone, for human beings to draw connections about gods? Well, it might be. Certainly, Chernobog and the Zariahs led an odd life in Chicago. Certainly, Mr. Nancy doesn't seem to be particularly backward about coming forward. Certainly, we've had examples of the Ifrit, for example, in Salim's story. even Bilquis to a certain degree, and certainly Technical Boy. To what degree are gods transparent to our understanding, and to what degree is there some kind of forceful opacity, something that pushes back against our spontaneous comprehension? Can human beings understand gods without explicit instruction? And if they can't, if there is something about the nature of godhood that pushes back against our comprehension, that resists understanding, that resists kind of logical deduction in this form, does that explain a lot to us about Shadow's thought process in the first part of the book? Does that tell us why he is having alternately such an easy time accepting things that seem to be impossible, and then such a difficult time accepting things which seem to be impossible, or sometimes a difficult time accepting things which seem to be much more possible than things which he just accepted without comment? Is this part of an interactive process in terms of Shadow's perception and Shadow's judgment? Well, it seems to me that it is. This, I think, is why Shadow is having so much trouble pinning down the obvious conclusion that when Wednesday was pulling these two-man scams, there was another man. That seems pretty straightforward. Yes, said Wednesday, yes, I had a partner, a junior partner, but alas, those days are gone. Any guesses, anyone? Any guesses, anyone who is into Norse mythology? Any guesses, anyone who, and this is no fault of Gaiman's. I think we have to try and remember that back in the year 2000, back in 2001, Norse mythology was not as prevalent, as not as commonplace, not as easily parsed for the movie-going public as it is now. We've had 2 Thor movies, we're about to have a third, and we've had 2 Avengers movies, which have touched in part on Asgardian mythology. That wasn't true when Gaiman wrote this book, and it wasn't true for the first, 10 years, 11 years of people reading this book. Loki was not the figure that Loki is now in pop culture 15 years ago. That's just, an observable truth. Our perception of Loki has been completely tainted by Tom Hiddleston and his magnificent performance in the Thor movies and the Avengers movies too. And I'm looking forward to Thor Ragnarok. You guys, that trailer is pretty good. So I'm looking forward to another visit to the MCU version of Norse mythology. But we must remember that while it may seem obvious to us that Odin is here referring to Loki, that may, or at least presumably referring to Loki, right? That may not have been as transparently obvious to readers 15 years ago, because the cultural landscape was just different and Norse mythology was not as readily accessible. Now, here's the thing, you're hanging out on a Tuesday evening with me talking about American gods, there's a good chance that you went through the same phase that I did in high school or even in middle school, where you devoured every book of mythology that you could get your hands on, that you read rapaciously through Greek and Roman mythology, through Egyptian mythology, through Norse mythology, of course, that you devoured these stories and have to some extent internalized them. But let's face it, we, my friends, are kind of nerds. So even if you would have got this 15 years ago, even if you did get this 15 years ago, that isn't necessarily indicative of how transparent this is supposed to be, if that makes sense. All of this is to say, I think that Gaiman is being a little more clever and a little more subtle than some modern readers give him credit for in this sequence. Yeah. Let me see here. Yes. Lauren here, speaking of what we were talking about earlier, I wonder when Shadow will hit, I'll just say Loki. Yes. That is conceivably a spoiler, though certainly by this point, probably not, right? Particularly when Shadow here just references, oh yeah, the guy that I knew in prison, he said that he pulled the thing that you were just talking about. Weird. Yes, Angela has a question here. Wednesday says his kind usually shoots blanks, which brought up so many questions. I realized, do Norse gods have affairs with mortals like Greek gods? Are there Norse demigods? No, there are, no in most versions of the stories. One of the problems with Norse mythology, one of the challenges with Norse mythology is that by the time that it was documented, it was already ancient. So there were already a wealth of stories, and they kind of entered a documentary form with kind of equal canonical weight. And then after the advent of Christianity in Northern Europe, after the push-pull of ideology across a continent for the better part of 1,000 years, after reinterpretation and the slow kind of geographical and cultural evolution of these stories, they have been adapted, they have been transformed. So in some instances, yes, I'm sure there are stories out there about Norse demigods, but there is not at the heart of Norse mythology the same tradition as there is in, say, Greek mythology or even Roman mythology. There just isn't that kind of I don't know, permeability between God society, the community of gods, and the community of men and women. There just isn't that same push, and it certainly isn't as joyous and gleeful as it seems to be sometimes in Greek mythological cultures. Yeah. But it is interesting that Wednesday accounts for yes, shooting blanks. And certainly implies that this is more the case now than it used to be. And that itself is interesting. Yes. But we're introduced to the idea that, hey, you know, gods don't have children. That is just not a thing that happens. Yeah. Good. As I scroll back down to the bottom of the YouTube chat and find here, yes. I'll just say the low-key pun in American Gods is either transparent or immediately revealed once you start thinking in those terms, or remains opaque to the end. And I don't think it's a question of intelligence, actually, or even a question of literacy in Norse myth. I think it is nothing more than a function of the way that you read words. If you are reading the words on the page, that is, if you are kind of focused on the shape of the letters, then I think that is a completely transparent, that is transparent in the sense that it will not present itself to you. It will not impede you as you move through the book. If you sound the words out in your head, if you have that inner voice that kind of tells you stories as you read, then I think it will strike you pretty much immediately. Certainly once you start thinking about Norse mythology. Yeah. I actually fall much more into the former camp, growing up reading fantasy stories, which often contained just terrible and ungainly, you know, character names, 15-syllable character names with apostrophes and sometimes an exclamation point thrown in. Hey, let's throw an asterisk and an ampersand into the middle, whatever. I would oftentimes simply have, oh, it's the character whose name starts with M. And that's it. And I would never figure out how to read or pronounce that name. It was one of the great turning points in my appreciation for Tolkien's literature in my late teen years, I suppose, when I started studying his poetry and started reading that poetry aloud and really began to understand the innate beauty, the euphony of many of Tolkien's poems, many of his names specifically. So from that point on, I have made an effort to always try to pronounce, always try to like have the sound of the words in my head as I read, but not always, particularly when I'm skimming a novel. Yes, good. Yeah, as Becca Eller says, I did the audiobook and low-key stuck out like a sore thumb instantly. Yes, of course. Sarah Thomas says I should embrace the Tolkien diphthong. I think this is Sarah urging me to pronounce Smeagol's name as Smeagol, which I will not do. I will not do. Yes. But I did just read, to tangent away to Tolkien again, last week in the There and Back Again session, I did just I read the account of Frodo and party coming upon Gildor's elves as they're transiting across the Shire. And we get the elven song, Alberath Gilthoniel, which is the song that they sing to Varda, which is just lovely. And I have kind of been repeating under my breath all week, just in these slow cycles, as though it's some kind of Buddhist meditative chant, just repeating the words Alberath Gilthoniel, because it's just so pleasing. It's just so beautiful. So yeah, okay. Anyway, that is the low-key pun. We'll come back to that in due course. We still have a bunch of slides to get to. And the next is Shadow's glimpse of a god. My car, said Shadow. I'll take good care of it. Have a good time in Lakeside, said Wednesday. He thrust out his hand and Shadow shook it. Wednesday's hand was colder than a corpse's. Jesus, said Shadow, you're cold. Then the sooner I'm making the two-backed beasts with a little hutsy-tutsy lass from the restaurant in the back room of the Motel 6, the better. And he reached out his other hand and squeezed Shadow's shoulder. Shadow experienced a dizzying moment of double vision. He saw the grizzled man facing him, squeezing his shoulder, but he saw something else. So many winters, hundreds and hundreds of winters, and a gray man in a broad-brimmed hat walking from settlement to settlement, leaning on his staff, staring in through windows at the firelight, at a joy and a burning life he would never be able to touch, never even be able to feel. Go, said Wednesday, his voice a reassuring growl. All is well, and all is well, and all should be well. One of the things that we have to think about, and okay, cards on the table, let's all just admit that we're all in, I guess, a pretty similar place. It's pretty gross when Wednesday seduces the 16 or 17-year-old waitress, and does so, we must note, and we definitely should note this because it will be absolutely crucial later. As he is chatting to her, as he is asking her about the local Motel 6, we get an account of him sketching runes in the salt on the table. And then he reaches up and touches her. And we're told that crumbs of salt are left behind on her face. We've had mention of Odin's charms before. We get this little double entendre earlier in the book when Shadow and Odin are talking about Shadow and Wednesday. I keep slipping and calling him Odin. I apologize. Shadow and Wednesday are talking about charm, and Wednesday effortlessly slips into charms. No, these are different things. This is not charisma. This is magic. That makes it worse. Let's be completely honest here. Putting the magical whammy on a teenager so that you can take her virginity, pretty bad, you guys. On the list of things that you can do to a person, that is, on the worst end of the scale. But this vision of Odin, of Grimnir, this vision of Wotan walking from settlement to settlement in the cold, being warmed both metaphorically and literally by human beings, must, of course, remind us of Bilquis. Bilquis is a goddess of sex, and thus sex is her primary means of worship. It is a primary means of sustenance. This is a necessary thing for her. Odin is not. And yet that intensity, that fire, that vitality, that life, that perhaps arguably innocence, arguably purity, ? These things reinvigorate him. They literally warm him. And it is, I would argue, much more the belief that Odin receives, the worship that Odin receives in this moment, than it is the actual sex itself. And certainly much more either of those things than it is the abuse, rape of a young woman who is presumably under some kind of magical influence. That doesn't make it better, or at least it doesn't make it okay. Perhaps it makes it incrementally, very slightly, you're not out of the woods yet, better. I think that is what we're supposed to see from here. That is what we're supposed to look at, yes. Aaron says, was it necessary at this point in the book to keep us from liking Odin too much? See, I think there's a little symmetry here between Wednesday seducing the waitress, the underage waitress, and what he says right at the beginning about men who act out of principle being the ones behind wars, men who think that what they're doing is right. And Shadow says, well, what do you do? And he says, I do what I want. By which we interpret that to mean I do what I am. I am this person, and thus the actions that I take are compatible with that. I think there is a sense in which Odin is just surviving. Wednesday is just getting through the world. He is cold now. That seems to be true. It doesn't seem to be. It is selfish. It is mercenary. It is abusive. But it is also arguably necessary. It is also arguably, this is what I'm saying, while we cannot, I think, in good conscience, applaud Wednesday for this, or even be okay with Wednesday for this, we can perhaps understand it as a necessity. And that doesn't redeem him. That doesn't kind of drag him back across that moral event horizon, but it does add at least a little complexity. It adds, if I may borrow from the TV show, the grit in the oyster. There may be something there around which we can build a more interesting and complex structure. Yeah. Yes, Andrea is calling out a question here that I would like some feedback on. I know that there are many people who listen to this podcast who are much more theologically literate than I am. But yes, I would like to interpret this here. As Andrea says, St. Julian, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Why is Wednesday quoting such a popular line from St. Julian? As Andrea says, St. Julian is medieval Christian, so the last line coming out of him did not make any sense to me. No, nor to me, I must admit. I recognized it, but I can't draw a connection between those two things. And as I said, my theological learning is perhaps not as sophisticated as it should be, certainly not as deep as it should be. So if there is a connection and I'm unaware of it, if this is Neil Gaiman playing some kind of very sophisticated theological joke, then I am super into that, but I will need you all to hold my hand and guide me through that one. Good. Good. All right. I am missing so much here in the YouTube chat. You are all brilliant. Yes, yes, good. Okay. So from there, we move on to the bus, and from there immediately into Shadow's dream. In the earth and under the earth, the marks on the wall were the red of wet clay, handprints, finger marks, and here and there, crude representations of animals and people and birds. The fire still burned, and the buffalo man still sat on the other side of the fire, staring at Shadow with huge eyes, eyes like pools of dark mud. The buffalo lips, fringed with matted brown hair, did not move as the buffalo voice said, "Well, Shadow, do you believe yet?" "I don't know," said Shadow. His mouth had not moved either, he observed. Whatever words were passing between the two of them were not being spoken, not in any way that Shadow understood speech. "Are you real?" "Believe," said the buffalo man. "Are you?" Shadow hesitated, and then he asked, "Are you a god, too?" The buffalo man reached one hand into the flames of the fire, and he pulled out a burning brand. He held the brand in the middle. Blue and yellow flames licked his red hand, but they did not burn. "This is not a land for gods," said the buffalo man. But it was not the buffalo man talking anymore, Shadow knew in his dream. It was the fire speaking, the crackling and the burning of the flame itself that spoke to Shadow in the dark place under the earth. "This land was brought up from the depths of the ocean by a diver," said the fire. "It was spun from its own substance by a spider. It was shat by a raven. It is the body of a fallen father, whose bones are mountains, whose eyes are lakes. This is the land of dreams and fire," said the flame. Our transition back to Buffalo Man. And we have here, well, we have here some interesting fuel for the fire. We have here some interesting points of argumentation, I suppose. Shadow's back. He's still, Shadow is back, and the Buffalo Man is still very concerned about Shadow's belief. But there's something else going on here, because, of course, Shadow, literate now as he is in the world, in the true world, is pulling back from his resistance. He is kind of stepping into belief. "Believe," said the Buffalo Man. "Are you?" Shadow hesitated, and then he asked, "Are you a god too?" We shouldn't overlook the hesitation there. "Are you?" Shadow hesitated, and then he asked, "Are you a god too?" When the Buffalo Man says believe, Shadow thinks gods. This is where we are now. "But this is not a land for gods," said the Buffalo Man. "Well, okay, then what? What are you? You know about gods. You value belief. What are you? What is this?" "This land was brought up from the depths of the ocean by a diver," said the fire. "It was spun from its own substance by a spider. It was shat by a raven. It is the body of a fallen father, whose bones are mountains, whose eyes are lakes. This is the land of dreams and fire." What do we make of those four, I guess, examples that the fire gives us? Brought up from the depths of the ocean by a diver, spun from its substance by a spider, shat by a raven, the body of a fallen father. Those sound to me like creation myths. Not compatible creation myths, not the same creation myth, but many different, disparate creation myths. And a few of you are shouting out right now in the YouTube chat about ravens. Yes, of course, ravens. And Jonathan Nash says, this is a big amalgamation of Native American traditions. Well, possibly, yes. I mean, these do all speak to Native American traditions, but that doesn't mean that they are exclusively Native American traditions. This is a land of dreams and fire, said the flame. It is clear, I think by this point, it is clear from pretty much the first moment that he shows up that the Buffalo Man is somehow representative of, at the very least, Native American religious practice, Native American theology, Native American worship and belief. He's a Buffalo Man. You guys, that's pretty emphatic. But is that all that he is? And if he does represent Native American belief, what do we make of that? What is the tension? Why is he coming to Shadow? What is the point of interaction? What is the mechanism of that interaction? And what is the purpose of that interaction? Why is this happening? Well, let's see if we can move on and then come back to some kind of answer about that. Yes, as Luke is calling out here, the buffalo used to own this land. They ran all over it, and then we removed them. I can see a buffalo god being jaded. Jaded is... Luke, jaded is a perfect word there. It has exactly the right kind of dispirited irony to it. Yes, he's a little jaded. He's a little worn out by this entire experience. I like that a lot. Yes, okay. Let's move on to bargaining, and ultimately, of course, as we mentioned earlier, to birth. What do I have to bargain with? Shadow asked. I have nothing. He could taste the clay now, thick and mud-gritty in his mouth. He could taste the sharp mineral tang of the rocks that surrounded him. And then Shadow said, except myself. I have myself, don't I? It seemed as if everything was holding its breath. Not just Shadow, but the whole world under the earth, every worm, every crevice, every cavern, holding its breath. I offer myself, he said. The response was immediate. The rocks and the earth that had surrounded him began to push down on Shadow, squeezed him so hard that the last ounce of air in his lungs was crushed out of him. The pressure became pain, pushing him on every side, and he felt he was being mashed, a fern becoming coal. He reached the zenith of pain and hung there, cresting, knowing that he could take no more, that no one could take more than this. And at that moment, the spasm eased and Shadow could breathe again. The light above him had grown larger. He was being pushed toward the surface. And then Shadow is birthed onto the surface, onto the earth. And I must admit, the first couple of times that I read this, I didn't get it. The first time that I read this book, I actually read this section twice because it feels so important and I didn't get it. What is the earth to Shadow? What is Shadow to the earth? This is ground and soil. And as I was thinking about it, maybe my third time through reading the scene, maybe my second time through the entire book, a synonym slotted into place and I understood. Because this is not earth or soil or dirt or rocks. This is land. This is the land. The landscape specifically is giving birth to Shadow. It is drawing him up from the crevice of memory, from the cave of antiquity here, the deep places below the earth, and it is propelling him backward into the light, under the stars, which we'll talk about in due course too. The land itself is giving birth to him. And the land itself, it seems to me, is represented in the Buffalo Man. The Buffalo Man doesn't have the same presence as a god because the Buffalo Man is not a god. The Buffalo Man, it seems to me, is apparent through this passage, is in some sense America. We'll continue to keep an eye on that as we move forward. Yeah. There's a lot of very smart conversation happening here about St. Julian in the YouTube chat, and I'm afraid that I'm not keeping up with it because, well, yes, all of this is fascinating, but I'll need to go and do some reading. I'll do some reading and I'll maybe talk about it next time. Yes. Yes, as Sarah Thomas says, lava becoming new land. Yes, you are made molten and fluid and pure and expelled, and thus you become new land. You are, I mean, raised from the ocean depths. You are shat by the raven, if you like. That one's probably less, less positive, but let's go with raised from the ocean depths by a diver. Yes, good. All right. I'm running a little late. Hey, drink, and I still have a few slides to get to. So let's move into Lakeside, shall we? Let's move straight into Lakeside. I won't even take that down. Okay. Young man, anything I can do for you? The old man was locking up the video store. He pocketed his keys. Store ain't open Christmas, he told Shadow cheerfully. But I come down to meet the bus, make sure everything was okay. Couldn't live with myself if some poor soul found himself stranded on Christmas Day. He was close enough that Shadow could see his face. Old but contented, the face of a man who had sipped life's vinegar and found it, by and large, to be mostly whiskey, and good whiskey at that. Well, you could give me the number of the local taxi company, said Shadow. I could, said the old man doubtfully, but Tom will be in his bed this time of night, and even if you could rouse him, you'll get no satisfaction. I saw him down at the Buck Stops here earlier this evening, and he was very merry indeed. Where is it you're aiming to go? Shadow showed him the address tag on the door key. Well, he said, that's a 10, maybe a 20-minute walk over the bridge and around, but it's no fun when it's this cold, and when you don't know where you're going, it always seems to take longer. You ever notice that? First time takes forever, and then ever after, it's over in a flash. Yeah, said Shadow. I never thought of it like that, but I guess it's true. Here is the mastery that Neil Gaiman displays as we get to Lakeside. We don't need anything else from Lakeside but this. All that we need to know about this town is contained here. It is perfect. The store ain't open Christmas, but I come down to meet the bus, make sure everything was okay. Couldn't live with myself as some poor soul that found himself stranded on Christmas Day. Well, this is just the nicest guy in the entire world. So Shadow says, give me the number of the local taxi company because I expect your small town here in Wisconsin to operate on the same rules as, I don't know, the rest of the world. Certainly the rest of the continent. Well, I could, but Tom will be in his bed this time of night. Because of course the local taxi service is a guy named Tom. And even if you could rouse him, you'll get no satisfaction. I saw him down at the Buck Stops Here. The Buck Stops Here is the perfect name for a bar. The Buck Stops Here for specifically a small town, what I would call from Scotland, pub. That is perfect. It is focused and it is precise and it is immediately charming. It is rousingly evocative and everything but everything that we need to get from Lakeside, we get immediately. Arguably, by the way, everything but everything that we need to get from Lakeside, we get from the girls on the bus. I wanted to pull that as a slide, but it's a little fractured. It's a little fragmented. It would have been difficult to move through. It would have taken us an extra 15 minutes to get through, and I don't have 15 minutes to spare, but I urge you to go back. If you didn't pay close attention to it, go back and look at the girls on the bus, particularly the fragments of conversation that we get, these disassociated fragments about high school life in Lakeside, about sex, about borrowing a snowmobile. Go back and look at that and think about what that evokes, this genteel image of a somewhat anachronistic America. This was 2000. This was 2001. The internet existed, you guys. It did. Girls on the school bus would not have been swapping stories about sex like they had read it in a teen magazine from the 1980s. This is already anachronistic. And every time we stumble upon anachronism, it seems to speak to some sense of America. It speaks of this timelessness of Americana. And I'm fascinated by that. Yeah. Luke Hopkins says, the Duck Inn Waddle Out is the best pub name. Luke, that is a fantastic pub name. I can't argue with that. The Duck Inn Waddle Out. Excellent. Excellent. Becca says, cheesy bar names are the best part of small towns. And Jonathan is pointing out, and an actual bar in Menominee. Is that how? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I do apologize. I have no idea how to pronounce it. That is the small town upon which Lakeside is roughly based, though more roughly than any of the other specific places given in American Gods. There's a reason that we're not in this real place, as we have been so often before. We are in a fictional place because Lakeside needs to be fictional, right? Excellent. As Angela says, Hinzelman is a perfect welcome wagon. Yeah, good. Well, we're about to get, I think, to the passage from Hinzelman that we all like, and if you're not already in love with him, this will do it, because this is what makes a town. Hinzelman pointed out the town's two restaurants as they passed them, a German restaurant and what he described as Greek, Norwegian, bit of everything, and a popover at every plate. He pointed out the bakery and the bookstore. What I say is, a town isn't a town without a bookstore. It may call itself a town, but unless it's got a bookstore, it knows it's not fooling a soul. He slowed Tessie as they passed the library so Shadow could get a good look at it. Antique gaslights flickered over the doorway. Hinzelman proudly called Shadow's attention to them. Built in the 1870s by John Henning, local lumber baron. He wanted it called the Henning Memorial Library, but when he died, they started calling it the Lakeside Library, and I guess it'll be the Lakeside Library now until the end of time. Isn't it a dream? He couldn't have been prouder of it if he had built it himself. The building reminded Shadow of a castle, and he said so. That's right, agreed Hinzelman. Turrets and all. Henning wanted it to look like that on the outside. Inside, they still have all the original pine shelving. Miriam Schultz wants to tear the insides out and modernize, but it's on the Register of Historic Properties, and there's not a damn thing she can do. So let's all just agree. It may call itself a town, but unless it's got a bookstore, it knows it's not fooling a soul. I mean, you guys, if there's a line that you want to get tattooed on some part of your body from the pages of American Gods, that is a really good candidate right there. That is a really good candidate. This is luminous, but again, almost too luminous. It's almost too much. It's almost too perfect. It is idyllic beyond the point of idyllic, particularly, I think, for those of us who, I had an interesting conversation via email, actually, with a listener who lives in California, in Southern California, and had real trouble with American gods because she has never traveled outside of like the southern states and has never spent any kind of time in snow. So when we get to Wisconsin and we're really talking about the deep winter, when we're talking, there's the passage right at the end of the chapter about the Arctic wind coming in and freezing the lake. She just couldn't imagine it. She just couldn't imagine it. And I tried to express how different this experience is when you know snow, when you know that deep cold that uncurls itself from the darkest places in the forest and stretches out across the land, that ancient cold, those starlit nights when you go out and the world is perfectly and beautifully crystalline and feels as though it has been that way forever. And when you feel that if you just hesitate, you too will be locked in it forever. That is a very special kind of experience. I love, personally, knowing this experience as I do, I love the way that Kamen evokes it. And I think it's so crucial to our understanding of Wisconsin, I suppose, of the northern climes here in our Midwest adventure, but of Lakeside specifically, because it is perfect. It is idyllic. It is just a little bit Stars Hollow, you guys. It is just a little bit too good to be true. And as Hinzelman is giving us this perfect tour in his perfect car of these perfect places, I don't know. I genuinely don't know to what degree we are supposed to feel comfortable and to what degree we are supposed to feel as though we are on a film set, to what degree we are supposed to feel as though we are in the Truman Show, for example. And even if we do feel that way, do we care? Does Shadow care? These are questions which we'll continue to track as we move through part 2 of this book. Let me see here as I scroll back up. Oh, Kate says we need t-shirts with that quote. That would be fantastic. Yes. Sarah actually makes an excellent point. I will definitely go to bat for you on this, Sarah. We're a small town, no bookstore, but a library is the same. Yes. I think a library in a small town that has no bookstore, a library will serve. Yes. Good. Excellent. Oh, yes. So Sarah also says, excuse my transgression of death of the author, but Gaiman loves Hinzelman to put these words, he loves Hinzelman to put these words in his mouth. Yes, and Aaron says, am I the only one who half expected Hinzelman's wife to be named Goldberry? A nice Tolkien reference there. But there is something Tom Bombadil about Hinzelman. He is a little out of step with the rest of the book for reasons which will become apparent. But yes, good. Okay. Oh, poor Elizabeth Stevens says in the YouTube chat, I'm suddenly missing small town Wisconsin again. Not so much in the summer, I bet. But I guess, yes. When I say not so much in the summer, I'm sure it's perfectly habitable in the summer. When I think about Wisconsin, when I think about the northern climes, I want the winter of it all. But I am a man given to extremes. I want to be where it is hot when it is hot, and I want to be where it is cold when it is cold, because I'm a glutton for punishment. There's some kind of masochistic spark. There's something pure about that experience, though. You know, there's something true about that experience, which I just love. Yes. And yes, we're kind of nodding toward a yes, we're nodding toward a kind of a Twin Peaks feel about, well, the problem with the Twin Peaks connection for Lakeside is simply that Twin Peaks never felt that perfect. I think eerie, perhaps, a little unsettling, but didn't ever have that facade. There are things about Twin Peaks which are perfect when Dale Cooper arrives in the first season, but those things are still, even then, few and far between. You know, it's not just bucolic. It's not just an idyll. There is something else about Twin Peaks too. Yeah. Good. All right, let's keep going. Oh, I will call out, actually, before we move on, Hinzelman and the deer story. I have tried to find a deeper meaning in the deer story, and I'm not convinced that there is one. I think the deeper meaning in the deer story is the moment when Shadow smiles at the end of the story, when once again he is returned, when Hinzelman has this great cap on the story and says, and if you're looking for proof, the antlers are hanging on my wall. I mean, that's good. That it's not quite a punchline, but it is a great wrap-up line to end that particular story. And then we get this description of Hinzelman as a master of his craft, and that, I think, ties us back to the discussions that we had earlier in the chapter with Wednesday. His accounts of the grifts that he ran, and I think that by the time that we are at this point in the novel, we are perhaps suspicious of storytellers, or at least Enchanted by Storytellers might be closer to the mark, but again, Hinzelman will come back. Yes. Good. All right, 10 minutes to do 2 more, and one of those is the Sam slide, so I definitely can't skip that one. Shadow makes his way to his new home and tries to rest. He wondered how long he would have to wait until Wednesday came for him. A day, a week, however long he knew he had to focus on something in the meantime. He would start to work out again, he decided, and practice his coin sleights and palms until he was smooth as anything. Practice all your tricks, somebody whispered inside his head in a voice that was not his own. All of them but one, not the trick that poor, dead Mad Sweeney showed you, dead of exposure and the cold and of being forgotten and surplus to requirements. Not that trick. Oh, not that one. But this was a good town. He could feel it. He thought of his dream, if it had been a dream, the first night in Cairo. He thought of Zariah, what the hell was her name? The Midnight Sister. And then he thought of Laura. It was as if thinking of her opened a window in his mind. He could see her. He could somehow see her. She was in Eagle Point, in the backyard outside her mother's big house. She stood in the cold, which she did not feel anymore, or which she felt all the time. She stood outside the house that her mother had bought in 1989 with the insurance money after Laura's father, Harvey McCabe, had passed on a heart attack while straining on the can, and she was staring in, her cold hands pressed against the glass, her breath not fogging it, not at all, watching her mother and her sister and her sister's children and husband in from Texas, home for Christmas, out in the darkness. That was where Laura was, unable not to look. Tears prickled in Shadow's eyes, and he rolled over in his bed. So much to discuss, so much to pull. Let's talk about the voice. Practice all your tricks, somebody whispered inside his head in a voice that was not his own. All of them but one, not the trick that poor dead Mad Sweeney showed you, dead of exposure and the cold and of being forgotten and surplus to requirements. Not that trick, oh, not that one. But this was a good town. He could feel it. I am most interested here in that word but. Because Shadow is pushing back, and as loath as I am to spend any time at all talking about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, it does feel to me a little bit like the influence of the ring in The Lord of the Rings, because here we get this monologue, here we get this reassurance, this almost seductive voice from within. Practice all your tricks, all of them but one, not the trick that poor dead Mad Sweeney showed you. But this was a good town. He could feel it. Why the but? Why is he pushing back against that idea? And why is the goodness of the town in any way related to the performing of the trick that Mad Sweeney showed him? Well, we'll get to that too. So then he thinks of his dream. If it had been a dream that first night in Cairo, he thought of Zariah, what the hell was her name, the Midnight Sister, and then he thought of Laura, and suddenly he is there. And it's been a little while since we've had Gaiman's expansion of text, since we've had Gaiman's overwhelming stream of consciousness prose. But that paragraph about Laura is heartbreaking. All of the incidental detail just poured into him. All of this momentum and experience, unprocessed, unfiltered, completely raw, pulled through him. Out in the darkness, that was where Laura was, unable not to look. Even that construction, out in the darkness, that was where Laura was, unable not to look. That's, God, so profoundly beautiful. Tears prickled in Shadow's eyes, and he rolled over in his bed. And I have to admit, tears prickled in my eyes too. I find that to be a completely mesmerizing paragraph of prose. What do we make of this ability to suddenly see Laura? What do we make of his ability in mere moments to suddenly see Wednesday? Well, we can speculate, but we will circle back around to that very soon too. Yes. Yes, Sarah Thomas is saying in YouTube chat, you guys have mentioned this is such a great chapter. Sarah, I completely agree with you. What is perhaps most interesting about this chapter is the way that though it seems to slow down once we get to Lakeside, though it literally slows down once we get to Lakeside, the pace of Shadow's experience increases. We do build a great deal of momentum as we move toward the end. It's not a focused momentum. We're not actually going anywhere, but you can feel the pace increasing under you. It feels got almost like anxiety. It's almost like a panic attack, this rising of something within Shadow, this tension between this voice that speaks within him but is not his own, his glimpse of Laura, his glimpse of Wednesday. These moments are pushing him forward, and then we have these anchors, these points that tie him back to, well, curiously, to Lakeside. Don't try the trick. But this was a good town. He could feel it. This was a good town. He could feel it. Yeah. Okay. Angela's pointing out that, yeah, the audiobook does give certain things away. It does. This is inevitable, I think. Yes. Okay. I only have a minute left. Let's wrap up here with, meanwhile, a conversation. This is, except for the first and last lines, entirely unattributed dialogue, and yet is... God, you guys, it's just perfect. I love the dialogue. As we mentioned when we met Sam for the first time, Sam is magnificent. Her Whedon-esque dialogue is pitch perfect. And here, rather than Shadow's more, I guess, laconic means of expression when he is with her, rather than this more deep and slow-moving kind of conversation, here we have a conversation that is sparky and bright and beautiful. And as I said, I would have just quoted the entire thing. I would have just, basically, you guys, I could have just read this entire chapter. It would have taken me 2 hours, but it would have been worth it. But instead, I pulled this slide, the end of the conversation. Ma'am, we know you helped Shadow. You were seen with him in a white Chevy Nova. He gave you a ride. He bought you dinner. Did he say anything that could help us in our investigation? 2 of our best men have vanished. I never met him. You met him. Please don't make the mistake of thinking we're stupid. We aren't stupid. I meet a lot of people. Maybe I met him and forgot already. Ma'am, it really is to your advantage to cooperate with us. Otherwise, you'll have to introduce me to your friends, Mr. Thumbscrews and Mr. Pentothal. Man, you aren't making this any easier on yourself. Gee, I'm sorry. Now, is there anything else? Because I'm going to say bye-bye now and close the door, and I figure you two are going to go and get into Mr. Carr and drive away. Your lack of cooperation has been noted, ma'am. Bye-bye now. Click. Sam is perfect. Becca Eller completely anticipated me here in the YouTube chat. Sam is perfect. Sam wins. All hail Sam, queen of everything. Yes. Yes, she is just great. Though I must admit, the thing that stood out to me here the most, just to bring us back to Hamilton, you guys, to bring us back full circle all the way back to Hamilton, please don't make the mistake of thinking we're stupid. We aren't stupid. I can't think of that line without reading it in the intonation of Hamilton. I'm not stupid. It has that same perfect cadence. Get into Mr. Carr kills me, says Jean in the YouTube chat. It absolutely does. Yes, as I've mentioned before, minor characters called Sam, pretty much always the best. That is going to do it. I will say the purpose of the Meanwhile a Conversation. Okay, I am within a margin of error completely certain that the purpose of Meanwhile a Conversation is to let Neil Gaiman write more Sam. It's to keep her present in the narrative for reasons which will become clear later. It's also, though, to keep us in some kind of uncertainty about Shadow's ultimate fate. We are reminded, we discussed the spooks right at the beginning of the chapter. So despite our brief interregnum in Cairo, and despite now moving to Lakeside, which seems just, gee whiz, the happiest place on earth, we're still aware of forces moving in the world beyond Shadow's control, outside of Shadow's perception. There are still forces out there, and he is not safe. And they are, to some extent, tracking him, and certainly threatening Sam, albeit fairly gently, albeit fairly indirectly. Threatening Sam is not a good way of making us, the readers, feel comfortable. Good. Luke says it would have been great if there had been a man named Mr. Carr. Mr. Carr drives the car. That's his purpose. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Oh, Lauren says, I'll say that if we hadn't talked about Sam not being done on the podcast, I would have been surprised to see Sam back as a person who is new to the novel. Lauren, that's really, really interesting. Even the first time that I read the novel, well, I guess I didn't know Sam would be back. I really hoped Sam would be back. I really hoped Sam would be back. She is so immediately present and fulfills no real function in the plot that I just assumed that we would come back to her. So I really felt the same way about Sam as the same way to a lesser degree. I felt the same way about Audrey as I did about Sam. She's so powerful on the page that seems almost incomprehensible that she won't at some point return. So yeah. Good. All right. Chesley's taking off. I think it is. Yeah, it's 9:30 sharp, guys. So we need to wrap up. But first, a word or two about our schedule. Tomorrow, Wednesday, May the 31st, you will get episode 13 of Storms on the Way, our discussion of Lemon Scented You. Then next Monday, you'll get our discussion of the 6th episode of the season, A Murder of Gods. That's Monday, June the 5th. There will, however, be no live session for Storms on the Way next week. Next week, I am clearing my schedule so that I can take a little time off and catch up with some much needed technical updates over on the website, over on the Patreon page. There's a ton of stuff that I have kind of let fall fallow because I haven't been keeping up with it because I've been so busy actually doing the live sessions. So next week there will be no live sessions from Point North Media. There will be a couple of things going out in the feeds just to keep you guys occupied, including the discussion of A Murder of Gods. That's next Monday. Then Monday, June 12th, we'll have our discussion of the penultimate episode of the TV show, A Prayer for Mad Sweeney. And then the following day, chapters 10 and 11. That's Tuesday, June 13th. So we'll come back 2 weeks from today to discuss the next 2 chapters of the book. That is going to do it. You guys, as ever, I should say, you can find the broadcast schedule over on pointnorthmedia.com. If you go there and you click the podcasts button at the top, then that will take you to a page with an embedded calendar that you can find. You can also visit twitter.com/pointnorthmedia, where you will find the pinned tweet right at the top of the timeline. There is the calendar. It's also available a few other places. You can probably find it on the Facebook page. Hey, I don't know, maybe if you just Google for Point North broadcast schedule, you can find it. Who knows how the internet works? We need Technical Boy to explain it. Gene says, oh no, what will I do in a town across country without a seminar? But time off is healthy. Yes, good. Sarah Thomas says, oh my goodness, Alistair's 11 is still Scottish. Do I say 11 in a particularly Scottish accent? There are a few weird words that still come out in my native accent. So yes, it is entirely possible that 11 is one of them. Now I'm thinking about it. Now I'm overthinking it. That'll do it for tonight, you guys. Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you all so much, as I said at the beginning of the show, for your support on Patreon. You are the ones who make all of this possible, and I am extremely grateful. If you have a moment and you haven't already, please go and rate and review Storms on the Way over on iTunes. If you have a moment and you haven't already, please tell a friend about Storms on the Way. We'd like maybe just a couple more people. We want to keep this a small exclusive club here, these live sessions. We super don't. Everyone is welcome. It'll all be just fine. That will do it for tonight, you guys. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care.